Modern agriculture did not abandon this crop because it failed. It removed it because it would not bend. For centuries, it grew without permission. It drew minerals from deep soil layers that shallow-rooted grains could not reach. It fed the poor and the powerful alike. It survived drought. It endured frost. It asked for little and returned much. That was the problem. In the early 1900s, as Western diets narrowed and fields began to move in uniform lines, this crop did not fit the new design. It was too independent, too resilient, too difficult to standardize. It did not rely on the fertilizers that industry was learning to sell. It did not collapse easily enough to justify replacement. And what cannot be controlled cannot remain. This archive exists for such stories, not to romanticize the past, not to accuse the present, but to open what was sealed and examine it in quiet light. Here at Ancient Food Files, we keep record of the crops that fed civilizations before yield charts and patent law. If these histories matter to you, remain with us. Preservation begins with attention. Tonight, we open the vault on a grain once known across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Its name is spelt. In Latin texts, it was called far. In the hills of Tuscany, it became farro. In the Levant, it appeared as hulled wheat in markets older than empire. Botanists now classify it as Triticum spelta, but long before taxonomy, it was simply bread. Its origins trace back more than 8,000 years to the Fertile Crescent, across regions now known as Mesopotamia and the upper valleys of the Tigris River and Euphrates River. Archaeologists have uncovered its grains in Neolithic sites buried beneath layers of ash and thyme. Charred kernels resting in clay storage jars, evidence not of wealth, but of continuity. In parts of Central Europe, oral traditions spoke of a grain that remembers winter. Farmers saved its seed not because it yielded the most, but because it returned faithfully after cold seasons that killed softer varieties. It was planted before the frost had fully released the soil. It waited. Physically, spelt does not resemble the naked wheat familiar today. Each kernel remains wrapped in a tough outer hull. It resists threshing. It does not separate cleanly from its protective casing. The grain must be coaxed free. This hull was once seen as a gift. It shielded the seed from pests, mold, and damp storage. It allowed harvests to endure months of uncertainty without chemical treatment. In monasteries across medieval Germany, spelt was stored whole, its armor intact, surviving winters that thinned other reserves. Biologically, its roots reach deeper than many modern wheats. They search for trace minerals in subsoil layers long ignored by shallow systems: magnesium, zinc, iron, the quiet elements that sustain nerve, blood, and bone. Spelt tolerates poor soil. It does not demand heavy nitrogen feeding. In fact, when over-fertilized, it grows too tall and risks falling. It evolved in balance with scarcity. Its architecture favors resilience over spectacle. This design made it ideal in times of collapse. During the Roman Republic, spelt formed part of the rations issued to soldiers. The Latin word farina, flour, descends from its name. It fed legions that marched across Europe. It sustained rural populations far from aqueducts and imperial granaries. Centuries later, during the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, when fields were trampled and trade routes severed, spelt returned in villages where other cereals failed. Its hard husk protected what little harvests could be gathered amid chaos. In the 19th century, alpine communities relied on it when rye succumbed to disease. Records from agricultural surveys in southern Germany describe spelt as dependable in uncertain climates, a modest phrase, heavy with implication. Then the 20th century arrived. Industrial milling required uniformity. Roller mills preferred grains that shed their husks easily. Wheat varieties were bred for naked kernels that could be processed quickly in massive quantities with minimal labor. Spelt's protective hull became an inconvenience. Its height made it prone to lodging under the high nitrogen fertilizers introduced in the early 1900s. New wheat cultivars responded dramatically to synthetic inputs. Spelt did not. It refused to transform into a high-yield spectacle under chemical encouragement. In agricultural reports from Britain and North America between 1910 and 1935, spelt acreage declined sharply. It was labeled old-fashioned, inefficient, unsuitable for modern baking standards that demanded elastic dough and consistent volume. White bread became a symbol of progress. Refined flour, stripped of bran and germ, carried the aesthetic of purity. Spelt, with its darker tone and denser crumb, belonged to an older story. It was not outlawed. It was simply edged out, unmanageable, unownable, inconvenient. The grain that had survived empire could not survive efficiency. By mid-century, Western diets narrowed to a handful of dominant wheat strains. Fields aligned into monocultures. Diversity thinned quietly. In the process, something else faded: memory. In regions where spelt had once been a survival food, it became associated with poverty, rural hardship, war years. To eat it was to remember scarcity. As economies stabilized, families chose softer breads, lighter textures. They chose distance from struggle. The rejection was not irrational, it was emotional. Foods carry history in their taste. When hardship recedes, its flavors often recede with it. Yet beneath this forgetting, the soil continued to change. Modern wheat, bred for high yields under fertilizer regimes, gradually reduced its mineral density as growth accelerated. Studies in the late 20th century began to measure declines in magnesium and zinc content across common grains. The numbers were modest but consistent. Researchers revisiting spelt in the 1980s and 1990s found a different profile: higher protein variability, greater concentrations of certain trace minerals, not miraculous, not exaggerated, simply intact. Agronomists studying sustainable systems noted its tolerance for low-input farming, its compatibility with organic cultivation, its resistance to some fungal pressures due to its hull. What had once been dismissed as backward now appeared quietly aligned with ecological caution. In an era of soil erosion and groundwater contamination, deep roots regained significance. In conversations about dietary diversity, ancient grains re-entered vocabulary not as novelty, but as continuity. Still, spelt did not roar back. It returned slowly, in small plots, in heritage bakeries, in farms that favored rotation over dominance. Climate instability has begun to test modern systems. Heat waves arrive earlier, rain patterns shift, fertilizer prices fluctuate with geopolitical strain. Monocultures reveal fragility when disease spreads across identical fields. Spelt was shaped in variability. It does not promise salvation, no single crop can, but it was prepared long ago for irregular seasons. Its design assumed scarcity. It evolved without expectation of chemical rescue. It persisted through empires that rose and fell without altering its fundamental architecture. That architecture still exists. The knowledge was never fully erased. Seeds remained in remote valleys. Farmers passed them quietly to neighbors. Agricultural gene banks cataloged samples without fanfare. Nature does not require permission to remember. What was removed from Western diets in the 1900s was not merely a grain. It was a relationship to endurance, a tolerance for density over softness, a trust in systems that regenerate slowly rather than surge briefly. Spelt waits in the soil much as it always has, wrapped in its husk, patient. If the coming decades demand crops that ask for less and return steadily, it will not need reinvention, only recognition. We do not recover such knowledge by accident. We recover it by looking where modern narratives chose not to. Here, we continue to open these archives, to examine what was set aside when efficiency became doctrine. If this record matters to you, remain with this work. Preservation is not loud, it is deliberate. The soil keeps its memory. So should we.